The roar of 20,000 voices echoed through the National Western Stock Show Arena in Denver, Colorado, as Cody West adjusted his grip on the bull rope one final time. January snow had been falling steadily outside, but inside the heated Coliseum, anticipation hung thick as summer humidity. Cody's breath formed small clouds in the chilled air as he settled onto Big Gun's massive back, feeling the animal's muscles bunch and roll beneath him like tectonic plates preparing to shift. 8 seconds, cowboy, muttered Jake Morrison, the veteran bullfighter crouched beside the chute. His weathered face bore the scars of a dozen encounters with angry bulls, each line telling a story of close calls and hard-earned wisdom. This one's got dynamite in his legs and a mean streak wider than the Colorado River. Cody nodded, his jaw set with the quiet determination that had carried him through 3 years on the professional bull riders circuit. At 26, he was finally hitting his stride, ranking 15th in the world standings with prize money that had lifted him out of the hand-to-mouth existence that plagued most riders. The endorsement deals were starting to materialize. Wrangler had approached him about a boot contract, and Red Bull was sniffing around for a potential partnership. Tonight's ride at the prestigious Denver event could cement his status as a legitimate star in the sport. Big Gun snorted and shifted beneath him, a massive Brahmacross with a reputation for spectacular dismounts. The bull had thrown his last 12 riders, earning him a spot among the elite bucking stock that separated the pretenders from the champions. Cody had drawn him in the championship round after posting the highest score of the night in his earlier ride, a performance that had the crowd on their feet and the television cameras focused squarely on his lean, determined face. "Remember what we talked about?" called out his traveling partner and mentor, Tommy Caldwell, from behind the chutes. Tommy's own riding career had ended 5 years earlier, when a bull named Tornado Alley had crushed 3 vertebrae in his back, but he'd channeled his passion into coaching the next generation of riders. He breaks left out of the gate, then spins right. Stay centered, keep your feet moving, and ride the rhythm. The arena lights blazed down like artificial suns, transforming the dirt floor into a stage where dreams were made and shattered in 8-second intervals. Cody could feel the familiar pre-ride cocktail of adrenaline and fear coursing through his veins as he wrapped the bull rope around his gloved hand, pulling the knot tight against his palm. Years of practice had made the routine automatic, but tonight felt different. Tonight carried weight beyond just prize money and points. His parents had driven up from their ranch outside Pueblo, Colorado, making the 3-hour journey through mountain snow to watch their son compete on the sport's biggest stage. His father, Bill West, had been a rodeo cowboy himself before age and injuries forced him into ranching full-time. His mother, Sarah, worried constantly about her son's chosen profession but understood that some dreams couldn't be talked out of, only lived through to their conclusion. "Riders up!" The announcement crackled through the arena's sound system as the championship round began. Cody watched his competitors take their turns, noting the aggressive nature of the bulls and the difficulty of the draws. 2 riders had been thrown in spectacular fashion, their bodies ragdolling through the air before hitting the dirt hard. One limped away, favoring his left shoulder. The other was helped from the arena by the sports medicine team. As his turn approached, Cody felt the familiar ritual taking over his consciousness. He pulled his protective vest tight across his chest, checking that the Kevlar panels sat properly over his ribs and spine. The mouthpiece went in next, followed by his black cowboy hat pulled down low over his eyes. Every movement was deliberate, practiced, designed to build confidence through repetition. "West, you're up." The gate coordinator's voice cut through the ambient noise of the arena. Cody climbed the chute rails, swinging his leg over Big Gun's broad back. The bull immediately reacted to his presence, pressing against the steel panels with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. Other riders and crew members positioned themselves around the chute, ready to assist or pull him to safety if something went wrong during the preparation. As Cody settled into position, he could feel Big Gun's power radiating upward through his seat bones. The animal was a coiled spring of muscle and attitude, bred for one purpose: to remove riders from his back as violently and efficiently as possible. Bulls like Big Gun were athletes in their own right, their careers measured not in championships won, but in cowboys humbled. "Good position," Tommy called out, checking Cody's form from outside the chute. "Keep those shoulders square and your chin tucked. This bull's going to try to jerk you forward right out of the gate." The crowd had grown restless during the preparation, their voices blending into a continuous rumble of anticipation. Cody blocked out the noise, focusing inward on the task ahead. 8 seconds. It sounded like nothing to people who'd never tried to stay aboard an angry bull. But those 8 seconds could stretch into eternity when 1,200 pounds of fury was doing everything possible to plant you in the dirt. He adjusted his grip one final time, feeling the rough texture of the bull rope against his palm. The rosin he'd applied earlier had created the perfect amount of tackiness, enough grip to maintain his hold without binding his hand dangerously to the rope. Getting hung up on a bull rope was every rider's nightmare, being dragged and trampled by an animal that viewed human beings as nothing more than irritating obstacles to be removed. "You ready, cowboy?" The gate man's hand rested on the latch, waiting for Cody's signal. Behind them, Big Gun had grown still, gathering himself like a predator preparing to strike. The calm before the storm. Cody nodded, his throat too dry for words. He pulled his hat down another fraction of an inch and took a deep breath of the arena's unique cocktail of dust, livestock, and human anticipation. This was it, the moment he'd trained for, dreamed about, sacrificed for. Everything that came before had led to these next 8 seconds. "Outside," he called out, his voice carrying clear and strong despite the tremor in his chest. The gate swung open and Big Gun erupted from the chute like a living explosion. The bull's first jump carried them 15 feet into the arena, his massive body twisting and contorting in midair with athletic grace that defied his size. Cody felt the familiar sensation of controlled chaos as the animal beneath him began his violent ballet, each movement designed to exploit gravity and momentum in ways that would separate rider from bull. Big Gun landed hard and immediately launched into his signature spin, rotating clockwise with enough centrifugal force to pull Cody's body toward the outside of the spin. The cowboy countered with years of muscle memory, shifting his weight and adjusting his seat to stay centered over the bull's powerful shoulders. His free arm pumped for balance while his riding arm absorbed the jarring impacts of each jump. 3 seconds in, and Cody was still in perfect position. The crowd was on its feet, sensing something special developing in the dirt below. Big Gun seemed to recognize that this rider was different from his recent victims, and the bull's efforts intensified accordingly. His jumps grew higher, his spins tighter, his transitions more abrupt and violent. At the 4-second mark, Big Gun changed tactics. Instead of spinning, he launched into a series of rapid-fire crow hops, each landing designed to compress Cody's spine and jar his grip loose from the bull rope. The impacts hammered through the cowboy's body like pile-driver blows, but his conditioning held. Hours in the gym and years in the saddle had prepared him for exactly this type of punishment. The halfway point came and went with Cody still in command. He could feel the ride building toward something special, the kind of performance that would be replayed on highlight reels and remembered long after the arena lights dimmed. His confidence grew with each successful second, feeding on itself and creating the zone that all great athletes know. That place where time slows down and everything becomes crystal clear. Big Gun, perhaps sensing his opportunity slipping away, made one final desperate attempt to unseat his rider. The bull gathered himself and launched skyward with everything he had, spinning and kicking simultaneously in a move that combined power, athleticism, and malicious intent. It was a magnificent display of what made him one of the premier bucking bulls in the sport. Cody felt himself slipping slightly to the left as they reached the apex of the jump. He corrected instinctively, pulling himself back to center just as Big Gun began his descent. They were falling now, gravity reasserting its dominance over the brief moment of flight. 7 seconds had elapsed. One more second and Cody would have his qualifying ride, his score, and his moment of glory. But sometimes, in the cruel mathematics of rodeo, 1 second might as well be an eternity. Big Gun hit the ground at an angle that Cody hadn't anticipated, the bull's left shoulder dropping lower than his right as they landed. The uneven impact created a violent sideways lurch that caught Cody off guard, his body suddenly out of sync with the animal beneath him. He felt his grip loosening on the bull rope as his weight shifted dangerously toward Big Gun's left side. In desperation, Cody tried to compensate by leaning back toward the center, but the movement came a fraction of a second too late. Big Gun, feeling the rider's weight shift, immediately capitalized by spinning hard to the left, using centrifugal force to complete what the uneven landing had started. Time seemed to freeze as Cody felt himself leaving Big Gun's back. The arena lights wheeled overhead as his body began its inevitable arc toward the ground. He had just enough time to register the crowd's collective gasp, the sound 20,000 people make when they witness the exact moment a dream dies. The impact came with brutal efficiency. Cody hit the arena dirt shoulder first, his right clavicle snapping on contact with an audible crack that was lost in the thunderous noise of Big Gun's hooves as the bull completed his victory dance nearby. The broken collarbone was just the beginning. As Cody's body continued its violent tumble across the hard-packed earth, his left hip took the brunt of the secondary impact, fracturing in 2 places and sending shockwaves of agony through his nervous system. For a moment, he lay motionless in the dirt, staring up at the arena lights that now seemed impossibly distant. The crowd's roar had faded to a dull buzz in his ears, replaced by the sound of his own labored breathing and the rapid-fire announcements from the public address system. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted the attempt as white-hot pain shot through his torso like electricity. Tommy Caldwell was the first to reach him, sliding to his knees in the dirt beside his fallen protege. The veteran's experienced eyes quickly assessed the situation, noting the unnatural angle of Cody's right shoulder and the way he held his left hip. "Don't move, son," Tommy said, his voice calm despite the concern etched across his weathered features. "Sports medicine's on the way. Just lie still and breathe." The arena's medical team arrived within seconds, their practiced efficiency a testament to the dangerous nature of the sport they served. Dr. Patricia Vance, the event's head physician, knelt beside Cody and began her initial assessment. Her hands moved with professional precision as she checked for signs of head trauma, spinal injury, and other potentially life-threatening complications. "Can you feel your fingers and toes?" she asked, her voice cutting through the fog of pain and adrenaline that enveloped Cody's consciousness. "Yeah," he managed to gasp, relief flooding his voice despite the agony radiating from his injuries. "Everything hurts, but I can feel everything." The next few minutes passed in a blur of medical terminology, radio communications, and the careful process of stabilizing Cody for transport to the hospital. As the paramedics worked to immobilize his shoulder and hip, he caught glimpses of his parents in the stands, their faces etched with worry and helplessness. His mother had her hands pressed to her mouth, while his father stood rigid with the forced composure that ranching men use to mask their emotions. The stretcher ride to the ambulance seemed to take forever, each bump and jostle sending fresh waves of pain through Cody's broken body. As they loaded him into the back of the emergency vehicle, he could hear the announcer trying to maintain the crowd's energy for the remaining riders, but the festive atmosphere had been replaced by the sobering reminder of rodeo's inherent dangers. "We'll follow you to the hospital," Tommy called out as the ambulance doors began to close. "Your folks are already on their way." As the ambulance pulled away from the National Western Stock Show complex, Cody stared through the small window at the arena lights growing smaller in the distance. Somewhere in that building, the competition was continuing without him. Other riders were pursuing the same dream he'd just watched slip away in 7 3/4 seconds of violent reality. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd ridden better than ever before, posting scores that would have won most events. But in bull riding, as in life, almost counted for nothing. 7 3/4 might as well have been 0. Big Gun had bucked for the full 8 seconds after dumping his rider, earning himself a score that, combined with Cody's incomplete ride, would go down in the record books as just another victory for the bull. At Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, the emergency room team was already prepared for their arrival. Dr. Marcus Thompson, an orthopedic surgeon with extensive experience treating rodeo injuries, took one look at the X-rays and delivered the news that Cody had been dreading to hear. "The clavicle is a clean break. We can fix that with surgery and have you back to normal function in about 3 months, Dr. Thompson explained, pointing to the fracture lines on the illuminated films. "The hip is more complicated. You've got fractures in 2 places, and while they should heal completely with proper treatment, we're looking at a minimum of 6 months before you can even think about getting back on a bull." 6 months. In the world of professional bull riding, 6 months might as well be 6 years. Sponsors didn't wait around for injured riders to recover, especially riders who weren't already established stars. The sport moved forward with relentless momentum, creating new heroes to replace the fallen ones with algorithmic efficiency. As the anesthesia for his emergency surgery began to take effect, Cody's last conscious thought was of Big Gun, still bucking somewhere in his mind's eye, still completing that perfect 8-second ride that had changed everything. The bull had done exactly what bulls were bred to do. He had won. Now it was up to Cody to figure out what came next in a life suddenly stripped of its central purpose and identity. The surgery lasted 4 hours, with Dr. Thompson and his team working to repair the complex hip fractures and stabilize the broken collarbone. When Cody finally woke up in the recovery room, the first thing he noticed was the absence of pain. The medications had wrapped his consciousness in a soft cocoon that made everything feel distant and unreal. The second thing he noticed was the silence. For 3 years, his life had been filled with the constant noise of the rodeo circuit. The roar of crowds, the announcer's voice, the thunder of hooves on dirt, the conversations with other riders about scores and draws and prize money. Now, in the antiseptic quiet of the hospital room, that absence of sound felt more overwhelming than the pain had been. His parents sat in chairs beside the bed, their faces etched with relief that he was awake and aware. His father still wore his good boots and Western shirt from the arena, while his mother clutched a hospital coffee cup like a lifeline. "How are you feeling, son?" Bill West asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that cowboy fathers used when emotions threatened to overwhelm practical concerns. "Like I got run over by a bull," Cody replied, attempting humor despite the circumstances. "What did the doctor say?" Sarah West reached for his uninjured hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "He said the surgery went well, but you're going to be laid up for quite a while. The important thing is that you're going to make a full recovery." Full recovery. The words should have been reassuring, but Cody understood the mathematics of his situation better than his parents did. 6 months out of competition might as well be a career-ending injury in a sport where riders aged out in their early 30s and sponsors demanded constant performance to justify their investments. Over the next few days, as the initial shock wore off and the reality of his situation began to set in, Cody started making the phone calls he'd been dreading. The conversation with his agent was brief and businesslike. There wasn't much to discuss when the client couldn't compete for the foreseeable future. The potential sponsors melted away like snow in spring sunshine, their interest cooling in direct proportion to his inability to provide a timeline for his return. Tommy Caldwell visited every day, bringing updates from the circuit and maintaining the optimistic fiction that Cody would be back soon. But even Tommy's weathered optimism couldn't hide the truth they both understood. Professional bull riding was a young man's game with no patience for extended absences, no matter how talented the rider or compelling his story. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, which the medications could manage, or even the loss of income, which he'd expected. The worst part was the silence, the absence of his phone ringing with offers and opportunities, the lack of text messages from other riders, the gradual fading of his presence from the sport's consciousness. If that story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories. 3 months after the accident, Cody West sat in the passenger seat of his father's pickup truck, watching the familiar landscape of southeastern Colorado roll past the window like scenes from a half-remembered dream. The rolling hills and endless sky that had once represented freedom and possibility now felt like boundaries of a prison he'd never intended to build. His right arm hung in a sling. The collarbone finally healed enough to begin physical therapy, but his hip still ached with every bump in the road, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen from his former life. The ranch house appeared around a bend in the gravel road, its weathered wood siding and metal roof unchanged from his childhood memories. Bill West had inherited the property from his own father, and 3 generations of the family had worked the same section of land, raising cattle and quarter horses with the steady persistence that defined ranching life. It was a good life by most measures. Honest work, clean air, and the deep satisfaction that came from building something that would outlast the builder. But for Cody, it felt like settling for something smaller than the dreams that had carried him away from this place. "Doc says another month of therapy and you should be close to 100%, Bill said as he parked the truck near the front porch. "Of course, that's physically. The mental part might take longer." Cody nodded without responding. The physical therapy sessions in Denver had been grueling but productive. His range of motion was returning gradually, and the strength in his injured hip improved each week. Dr. Thompson had been cautiously optimistic about his progress, suggesting that a full recovery was not only possible but probable. What the doctor couldn't fix was the growing certainty that recovery might be irrelevant to his chosen profession. Sarah West appeared on the porch as they climbed out of the truck, her face brightening with the forced cheerfulness that had become her default expression since the accident. "How did it go today? Did Dr. Martinez say anything about reducing the therapy sessions?" "Another 2 weeks, then we'll reassess," Cody replied, accepting his mother's careful hug. The physical therapist, Elena Martinez, had become something of a lifeline during his recovery, her combination of professional expertise and genuine encouragement providing structure to days that otherwise stretched endlessly ahead of him. Inside the house, everything was exactly as he remembered from his teenage years. The same furniture, the same family photos on the mantelpiece, the same worn spots on the hardwood floors where 3 generations had walked the same paths through their daily routines. His childhood bedroom had been converted to an office years ago, but his parents had quickly transformed it back when it became clear he'd be staying indefinitely. The indefinite nature of his residency was perhaps the hardest part to accept. At 26, he'd been accustomed to controlling his own schedule, making his own decisions, and living by his own rules. The independence that came with professional success had been intoxicating, even when it meant sleeping in truck stops and eating gas station food. Now he was back to family dinners at 6 o'clock and conversations about weather and cattle prices that had once seemed insufferably mundane. "Tommy called while you were gone," Sarah said, setting a plate of homemade cookies on the kitchen counter. "He's got some ideas about getting you back in the game when you're ready." Cody had been avoiding Tommy's calls with increasing frequency as the weeks passed. His mentor's unwavering optimism had become more difficult to bear than outright pessimism would have been. Tommy refused to acknowledge what Cody considered obvious: that 6 months out of competition in a sport like bull riding was essentially a career death sentence. The young riders coming up behind him wouldn't wait for his return, and sponsors had notoriously short memories for athletes who couldn't deliver immediate results. "Maybe later," Cody said, though he had no intention of returning the call. The conversations had become increasingly uncomfortable as Tommy tried to maintain enthusiasm for a comeback that seemed more unlikely with each passing week. That evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in shades of orange and purple, Cody tried to reconcile the person he'd been with the person he was becoming. For 3 years, his identity had been inextricably linked to his success as a bull rider. He was Cody West, the rising star, the young cowboy with unlimited potential and a bright future. Without that identity, he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke through his thoughts. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the ranch. Cody recognized the distinctive rumble of Tommy Caldwell's diesel pickup long before he could make out the truck itself. His stomach tightened with the familiar dread he'd come to associate with well-meaning visitors who wanted to discuss his future. Tommy climbed out of the truck with the same confident stride he'd maintained since his own riding career ended. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile as he approached the porch, but Cody could see the concern lurking behind his mentor's optimistic facade. "How's the hip feeling today?" Tommy asked, settling into the porch chair beside Cody without waiting for an invitation. "You look like you're moving better." "It's fine," Cody replied, though they both knew the improvement was relative. He was moving better compared to 3 months ago, but nowhere near the level required for professional competition. "What brings you out this way? Can a friend visit without needing a reason?" Tommy's tone was casual, but Cody detected the slight tension that indicated he had something specific on his mind. "Though since you asked, I've been talking to some people about opportunities that might interest you." "I'm not ready to compete, Tommy. You know that better than anyone." "Who said anything about competing?" Tommy pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. "There's a young riders' school in Mesquite that's looking for an instructor. Good money, chance to stay involved in the sport, help develop the next generation of talent." The suggestion hit Cody like a physical blow. Teaching young riders felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that his own competitive career was over before he was ready to make that admission. He'd seen other former riders take similar positions, and they always seemed diminished somehow, living vicariously through their students' successes while their own glory days faded into memory. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested in teaching right now," Cody said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Maybe when I'm older, but not yet." Tommy studied him with the patient expression of someone who'd had similar conversations with other injured riders. "Son, I know this isn't what you planned, but sometimes life forces us to adapt our dreams rather than abandon them entirely. You've got knowledge and experience that could help a lot of young cowboys avoid the mistakes we all make." "What mistakes?" The words came out sharper than Cody intended. Getting on Big Gun wasn't a mistake. That ride could have launched my career if I'd stayed on for one more second. Sometimes bad things just happen, and there's nothing you can do about it. "You're right," Tommy admitted. "Bad things do happen. But what matters is how we respond when they do. You can sit here feeling sorry for yourself, or you can find a way to move forward." The conversation ended uncomfortably, with Tommy driving away and Cody remaining on the porch as darkness settled over the ranch. His mentor's words stung because they contained enough truth to be painful. He was wallowing in self-pity, but knowing it didn't make stopping any easier. The future that had once seemed so clear and promising now felt like a blank page that he had no idea how to fill. Over the following weeks, Cody fell into a routine that revolved around physical therapy appointments and helping with ranch work that his injured hip could tolerate. Feeding cattle from the back of a pickup truck was a far cry from the adrenaline rush of bull riding, but it provided structure to days that otherwise stretched endlessly ahead of him. His father never commented on the arrangement, accepting his son's help with the same practical grace he'd shown when Cody left for the rodeo circuit years earlier. The ranch work also served as a form of therapy in its own right. There was something restorative about the rhythmic nature of daily chores, the satisfaction of completing tasks that had clear beginnings and endings. Fixing fence, moving cattle, maintaining equipment. These activities required attention and effort, but didn't demand the psychological investment that rebuilding a shattered career would require. One afternoon in late April, as Cody was replacing a section of damaged fence line, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Is this Cody West?" The voice was young, enthusiastic, and unfamiliar. "Yeah, who's this?" "My name's Jake Morrison, not the bullfighter, different guy. I'm a reporter with Western Sports Today. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about your accident at the National Western." Cody's initial impulse was to hang up. He'd successfully avoided media attention during his recovery, partly because there hadn't been much interest in a story about a rider who might never compete again. "I'm not really doing interviews right now. I understand and I appreciate your time. The thing is, I'm working on a piece about the long-term effects of rodeo injuries, and your situation represents something a lot of riders face, but don't talk about publicly. The mental and emotional challenges that come with career-ending accidents." "Who says my career is over?" The words came out automatically, but even as he spoke them, Cody realized how hollow they sounded. Jake's tone softened. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to assume anything. But you've been out of competition for 4 months, and you haven't made any statements about when you might return. A lot of people are wondering what's next for Cody West." The conversation that followed was longer than Cody had intended, but Jake Morrison proved to be a thoughtful interviewer who understood the complexities of professional rodeo better than most sports journalists. He asked intelligent questions about the financial realities of recovery, the psychological impact of losing sponsorships, and the difficulty of maintaining hope when the path forward seemed unclear. "The hardest part isn't the physical recovery," Cody found himself saying. "It's the silence. When you're competing regularly, your phone rings constantly. Agents, sponsors, other riders, media. Now it feels like the sport has moved on without me, and I'm not sure there's a place for me when I'm ready to come back." "Do you think you will come back?" Jake asked gently. Cody hesitated, the question hanging in the spring air like smoke from a distant fire. It was the first time anyone had asked him directly, and the first time he'd been forced to articulate an answer to himself. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "Physically, I'll probably be able to compete again. But the sport is different now than it was 6 months ago. New riders, new sponsors, new stories. I'm not sure there's room for old stories about riders who used to be good." The article appeared in Western Sports Today 2 weeks later, and its impact surprised everyone involved. Jake Morrison had crafted a thoughtful piece about the hidden costs of rodeo injuries, using Cody's story as a framework for discussing issues that affected hundreds of athletes but rarely received public attention. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Cody's phone, silent for months, suddenly came alive with calls and messages. Other injured riders reached out to share their own stories, thanking him for giving voice to experiences they'd thought were uniquely their own. Sponsors expressed interest in supporting his recovery, not necessarily for competitive purposes, but as an example of perseverance and resilience that aligned with their brand values. Most surprisingly, invitations began arriving for speaking engagements at rodeo schools, youth organizations, and sports medicine conferences. People wanted to hear from someone who could articulate the mental and emotional challenges of sports injuries from personal experience. "Looks like you've got some decisions to make," Bill West observed one evening as Cody sorted through the stack of letters and emails that had accumulated during the day. "Yeah, but I'm not sure what any of it means," Cody replied. "I never wanted to be a spokesperson for injured athletes. I just wanted to ride bulls. Sometimes what we want and what we need aren't the same thing." his father said with the quiet wisdom that had guided his own transition from rodeo cowboy to rancher decades earlier. The question is whether you're ready to stop looking backward and start looking forward. That night, Cody sat at his desk and wrote his first honest assessment of his situation since the accident. He made lists of his options, his financial needs, his long-term goals, and his realistic timeline for making decisions. For the first time in months, he felt like he was taking active control of his future rather than simply waiting for circumstances to dictate his choices. The exercise revealed something he hadn't expected. While his dream of bull riding stardom might be over, his connection to the sport and its community remained strong. The speaking invitations weren't about his competitive achievements. They were about his ability to articulate experiences that resonated with people facing their own challenges and transitions. By the time the sun rose over the Colorado plains, Cody had made his first definitive decision since the accident. He would accept 3 speaking engagements, one at a high school rodeo clinic, one at a sports medicine conference, and one at a youth ranch program. Not because he was ready to abandon his competitive dreams entirely, but because he was finally ready to explore what else might be possible. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. For months, he'd been trapped between his old identity and an unknown future. Now, for the first time, he could see a path that honored both his past experiences and his current reality. It wasn't the path he'd planned, but it was a path nonetheless. As he prepared for his first speaking engagement, Cody realized that his story wasn't ending. It was simply changing direction in ways he'd never anticipated. The boy who'd left this ranch to chase bull riding glory was returning as a man with different dreams, but the same fundamental desire to make a meaningful contribution to the world he loved. The high school gymnasium in Sterling, Colorado, smelled exactly like every other school gym Cody had ever entered. A combination of floor wax, adolescent energy, and the lingering presence of countless basketball games and assemblies. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a small stage where a microphone stand waited under harsh fluorescent lights. As Cody adjusted the microphone height and looked out at the 50 teenagers who comprised the local high school rodeo team, he felt more nervous than he had before any bull ride. "Testing, testing," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. The students looked back at him with the polite attention that teenagers reserved for adult speakers, their expressions suggesting they expected to be bored for the next hour. He recognized that look from his own high school days, when guest speakers had seemed impossibly old and disconnected from anything relevant to his life. The event coordinator, an energetic woman named Beth Martinez, who taught agricultural education at the school, introduced Cody with the kind of enthusiasm that made it clear she'd researched his background thoroughly. She mentioned his ranking on the professional circuit, his victory at smaller events, and his promising career trajectory before the accident that had brought him to Sterling instead of some arena in Texas or Oklahoma. "But what I think makes Cody's story particularly valuable," Beth concluded, "is his willingness to talk honestly about what happens when our plans don't work out the way we expected." As Cody took the microphone, he abandoned the speech he'd prepared in favor of something more spontaneous and authentic. "How many of you have ever been told that rodeo is dangerous?" he asked, and nearly every hand in the room went up. "How many of you have been told that you should have a backup plan because rodeo careers don't last forever?" Again, most hands rose. "I heard the same things when I was your age," he continued, feeling the crowd's attention focus more intently on his words. "And like most of you, I figured those warnings applied to other people. I was going to be different. I was going to be the one who made it to the top and stayed there." He told them about the accident, but not in the way he'd expected to. Instead of focusing on the dramatic moment of the fall or the severity of his injuries, he talked about the aftermath. The silence, the loss of identity, the difficulty of imagining a future that looked nothing like the plans he'd made. The students listened with an attention he hadn't anticipated, their body language shifting from polite tolerance to genuine engagement. "The thing is," Cody said, "everybody talks about having a backup plan, but nobody talks about how to actually use one. When your original dream gets derailed, how do you figure out what comes next? How do you know if you're adapting to reality or giving up too easily?" A hand shot up in the front row. A girl who couldn't have been more than 16, wearing a rodeo team jacket and boots that had seen serious arena time. "Did you ever think about quitting rodeo completely? Like, maybe trying something totally different?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. "Honestly? Yeah, I thought about it. There were days when I wondered if I should go back to school, learn a trade, find something completely unrelated to rodeo. But I realized that the sport had given me more than just competitive experience. It taught me about preparation, about handling pressure, about getting back up when you get knocked down. Those skills transfer to whatever you do next. Another hand went up, this one from a lanky boy in the back row who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. So are you done competing? Like forever? Cody paused, realizing that this was the first time he'd been asked the question by someone who had no agenda beyond curiosity. I don't know, he said, and the honesty in his voice seemed to surprise even him. 6 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. I was going to come back stronger than ever. But the longer I'm away from competition, the more I realize that there might be other ways to stay connected to the sport that are just as meaningful. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Cody had experienced. These teenagers asked questions that adults had been too polite or too uncomfortable to voice. They wanted to know about money, how much riders actually made, what happened when the paychecks stopped, whether sponsors really cared about athletes as people or just as marketing opportunities. They asked about fear, about family pressure, about the loneliness of traveling the circuit. Most surprisingly, they asked about happiness. Did competing make him happy, or was it something else? Did he miss the actual riding, or did he miss the attention and recognition that came with success? If he could go back and choose a different path, would he? You know what I miss most? Cody found himself saying. It's not the 8 seconds on the bull, though that was incredible. It's the community. The other riders, the crew members, the stock contractors, even the fans. Rodeo creates this extended family of people who understand something about each other that outsiders don't get. Being away from that community has been harder than being away from competition. After the presentation, several students approached him with more personal questions. The girl who'd asked the first question introduced herself as Katie Morrison, and she wanted to know about opportunities for women in professional rodeo. A senior named Marcus Williams was wrestling with his parents' pressure to attend college instead of pursuing his dream of competing professionally. The thing is, Marcus said, they're not wrong about the risks. But they don't understand that not trying feels like a bigger risk to me. How do you know when to listen to practical advice and when to follow your heart? Cody thought about the question during the 2-hour drive home to his family's ranch. How did you know? He'd followed his heart onto Big Gun's back, and it had led to a broken body and a derailed career. But following his heart had also given him 3 years of incredible experiences, relationships that would last a lifetime, and a sense of purpose that he was only now learning to redefine. The second speaking engagement came 3 weeks later at the annual conference of the American Sports Medicine Institute in Colorado Springs. The audience couldn't have been more different from the high school students, physicians, physical therapists, sports psychologists, and researchers who dealt with athletic injuries every day, but rarely heard from the athletes themselves about the psychological aftermath of career-threatening accidents. Dr. Patricia Vance, the physician who'd treated him in Denver, had recommended him for the speaking slot after reading the Western Sports Today article. We're very good at fixing broken bones, she'd told the conference organizers, but we don't always understand the human cost of what happens when an athlete's identity gets broken along with their body. Cody's presentation to the medical professionals was more technical and analytical than his talk to the high school students, but no less personal. He walked them through his recovery timeline, not just the physical milestones but the emotional and psychological challenges that had accompanied each phase. He talked about the loss of income and sponsorships, the isolation from his professional community, and the difficulty of maintaining hope when the future seemed uncertain. From a medical standpoint, my recovery has been textbook, he explained to the audience of healthcare providers. But the emotional recovery has been much more complicated. Nobody prepared me for how to rebuild an identity that had been completely centered around athletic performance. During the question and answer session, a sports psychologist named Dr. Rachel Chun asked about the role of mental health support during his recovery. What kind of psychological resources were available to you, and what would have been most helpful? Cody had to think carefully about his answer. Honestly, I didn't seek out any formal mental health support. There's still a stigma in rodeo culture around that kind of thing. Cowboys are supposed to be tough, supposed to handle whatever life throws at them without complaining. But looking back, I think I would have benefited from talking to someone who specialized in athletic identity transitions. The comment sparked a lengthy discussion about the barriers that prevented athletes, particularly those from rural or traditional sports backgrounds, from accessing mental health resources. Several conference attendees approached Cody afterward to share their own observations about the intersection of athletic injuries and psychological well-being. Dr. Martinez, his physical therapist, was in the audience and caught up with him after his presentation. "You know, Cody, you're doing something here that could have real impact. There are a lot of athletes struggling with similar transitions, and most of them don't have anyone to talk to who really understands what they're going through." The idea that had been forming in the back of Cody's mind since his first speaking engagement began to crystallize into something more concrete. There was clearly a need for someone who could bridge the gap between the medical community's technical expertise and the lived experience of athletes facing career transitions. He had knowledge that could be valuable to both communities: athletes who needed hope and perspective, and healthcare providers who wanted to better understand their patients' psychological needs. The third speaking engagement took him to a youth ranch program outside of Durango, Colorado, where at-risk teenagers spent 6 months learning life skills through ranch work and outdoor activities. The program director, a former social worker named Linda Chavez, had invited Cody after hearing about his presentations at the medical conference. "Our kids have all experienced significant setbacks in their lives," Linda explained as they walked through the ranch facilities. "Some have been in trouble with the law, others have struggled with addiction or family problems. They understand what it means to have your plans derailed by circumstances you didn't expect." The group Cody addressed was smaller than his previous audiences, only 15 teenagers, but their attention was immediate and intense. These young people had no patience for motivational platitudes or success stories that seemed disconnected from their reality. They wanted honest talk about failure, disappointment, and the messy process of rebuilding after everything fell apart. "I'm not here to tell you that everything happens for a reason," Cody began, "because sometimes bad things just happen and they don't serve any higher purpose. But I am here to talk about what you do after the bad thing happens, when you're trying to figure out how to move forward." One of the participants, a 17-year-old named Alex who'd been in and out of foster care since childhood, challenged him immediately. "Easy for you to say, man. You had a career, you had success, you had family support. Some of us never had any of that to begin with." The comment forced Cody to examine his own assumptions about resilience and recovery. Alex was right. Cody's recovery had been supported by loving parents, financial resources, and a community that respected his achievements. Many people facing setbacks didn't have those advantages. "You're absolutely right," Cody acknowledged. "I've had privileges and support systems that not everyone has access to. But I've also learned that sometimes the most important factor in recovery isn't what resources you have available. It's whether you can find one person who believes in your ability to create something better than what you had before." The conversation that followed was raw and honest in ways that surprised everyone involved. The teenagers shared stories about disappointment, abandonment, and the challenge of maintaining hope when life seemed determined to knock them down repeatedly. Cody found himself talking about aspects of his own experience that he'd never discussed publicly. The nights when he'd wondered if his life had peaked at 26, the mornings when getting out of bed felt like an insurmountable challenge, the slow process of learning to derive meaning from something other than external validation. "The weird thing is," said a girl named Sarah who'd struggled with drug addiction, "it sounds like your accident kind of broke you open in a good way. Like, maybe you needed to lose the thing you thought you wanted in order to find the thing you actually needed." Her observation stayed with Cody during the long drive home that evening. Maybe she was right. Maybe the accident had forced him to confront questions about purpose and meaning that he might have avoided if his competitive career had continued according to plan. The speaking engagements had revealed something he hadn't expected: that his most valuable contribution might not be his athletic achievements, but his willingness to talk honestly about what came after those achievements ended. That night, he called Tommy Caldwell for the first time in weeks. His mentor answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for the call. "I've been thinking about that teaching position you mentioned," Cody said without preamble. "Not the one in Mesquite, but something different. What if there was a way to work with injured athletes during their recovery? Not just the physical rehab, but the mental and emotional aspects that nobody talks about." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing the unexpected direction of the conversation. "You mean like sports psychology? Sort of, but more practical. Someone who's actually been through the experience and can help athletes understand that there are ways to stay connected to their sport even if their competitive careers are over. Someone who can help them see that losing one dream doesn't mean giving up on all dreams." That's a hell of an idea, son. You thinking about going back to school for something like that? Cody looked out his bedroom window at the Colorado landscape that had shaped his childhood and was now witnessing his reinvention. Maybe. Or maybe there's a way to start smaller, with the speaking engagements and see where it leads. The thing is, I'm finally starting to feel like I have something valuable to offer that doesn't require me to get back on a bull. The admission felt like both an ending and a beginning. For months, he'd been trapped between his old identity as a competitor and an unknown future. Now, for the first time, he could see a path that honored both his past experiences and his current reality. It wasn't the path he'd planned, but it was a path nonetheless. Over the following weeks, Cody began researching programs that combined sports psychology with peer mentoring for injured athletes. He reached out to the medical professionals he'd met at the conference, exploring possibilities for formal training or certification. Most importantly, he started saying yes to more speaking opportunities, each one teaching him something new about the intersection of athletic achievement and human resilience. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It happened gradually, in small increments that accumulated into something larger. Phone calls returned. Emails multiplied. Opportunities emerged. But this time, the attention wasn't focused on his potential as a competitor. It was recognition of his value as someone who could help others navigate the difficult transition from athletic dreams to post-competitive reality. 4 months after his first speaking engagement, Cody received a call that would change everything. Dr. Chun, the sports psychologist from the medical conference, was starting a new program at the University of Colorado's Sports Medicine Center. They were looking for someone to develop a peer mentoring component for injured athletes, someone who could bridge the gap between clinical treatment and lived experience. We've got the medical expertise and the psychological frameworks, Dr. Chun explained during their phone conversation. What we need is someone who can translate that knowledge into language that makes sense to athletes who are struggling with identity and purpose after their competitive careers are interrupted or ended. The position would require him to complete additional training in counseling techniques and sports psychology, but it would also allow him to develop programming based on his own experiences and insights. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been imagining but hadn't dared to hope actually existed. "I'm interested," Cody said, surprised by how quickly the words came. "When do we start?" 2 years after his accident at the National Western Stock Show, Cody West stood in front of a different kind of audience in a conference room at the University of Colorado Sports Medicine Center. Instead of an arena filled with cheering spectators, he faced 8 athletes whose careers had been derailed by injuries ranging from torn ACLs to traumatic brain injuries. They represented different sports: football, gymnastics, skiing, basketball, but their expressions carried the same mixture of uncertainty and guarded hope that Cody recognized from his own recovery journey. "My name is Cody West, and 18 months ago I thought my life was over," he began, his voice steady despite the significance of the moment. This was his first official session as a peer counselor in the university's newly launched athlete transition program, the culmination of a year of intensive training in sports psychology, group facilitation, and crisis intervention. The program represented a radical departure from traditional sports medicine approaches, which had historically focused almost exclusively on physical rehabilitation. Dr. Rachel Chun, now the program director, had fought hard to secure funding for an initiative that acknowledged the psychological and emotional dimensions of athletic injuries. Cody's role was to serve as both counselor and living example of the possibility for meaningful life after competitive sports. "Tell me about the worst day of your recovery," he said to the group, settling into the chair that marked him as facilitator rather than patient. "Not the day you got injured. We'll get to that later. The worst day after you realized that everything you'd planned for your life might need to change." The question hung in the air for several seconds before Maria Santos, a former Olympic hopeful in gymnastics whose career had ended with a spinal injury, broke the silence. "The day my coach stopped returning my phone calls," she said quietly. "I'd been training with him for 8 years, and suddenly it was like I didn't exist anymore." Nods of recognition rippled through the group. Jeremy Walsh, whose football scholarship had been revoked after his 3rd concussion, leaned forward in his chair. "For me, it was watching my teammates practice without me. Standing on the sideline in street clothes while they prepared for games I'd never play in again." One by one, the athletes shared their stories of abandonment, isolation, and the particular cruelty of being forgotten by institutions that had once defined their worth through their performance. Cody listened with the focused attention he'd learned during his counseling training, but also with the deeper understanding that came from having lived through similar experiences. "Here's what I want you to know," he said when the last story had been shared. "Everything you're feeling right now is normal. The anger, the grief, the sense that nobody understands what you're going through. It's all part of a process that doesn't have a timeline or a predictable trajectory. But it is a process, which means it's leading somewhere, even when you can't see where that might be." The session lasted 2 hours, following protocols that Dr. Chun and Cody had developed together over months of planning and pilot programs. They covered practical issues like financial planning and career exploration, but they also addressed the more fundamental questions about identity and self-worth that arose when athletic achievement was no longer available as a source of validation. After the participants left, Cody and Dr. Chun debriefed in her office, a space that managed to feel both professional and welcoming despite the institutional fluorescent lighting. The walls were covered with certificates and degrees that testified to her expertise, but also with photos of former patients who'd successfully navigated the transition from athletic careers to fulfilling post-competitive lives. "How did that feel?" Dr. Chun asked, reviewing her notes from the session. "Any observations about group dynamics or individual participants that we should discuss?" Cody considered the question carefully. Leading the group had felt natural in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it had also been emotionally demanding in ways he was still processing. "Maria's situation reminds me a lot of my own experience with sponsors disappearing. The betrayal aspect is huge, when people who claim to care about you suddenly act like you never existed. What helped you work through that particular aspect of your recovery?" "Time mostly, and eventually realizing that those relationships were always transactional, even when they felt personal. The people who really cared about me as a person rather than a performer, they stuck around." Dr. Chun made notes as they talked, but Cody could see her genuine satisfaction with how the program was developing. They'd spent months working together to create something that didn't exist elsewhere, a comprehensive approach to athletic identity transition that combined clinical expertise with peer support from someone who'd actually lived through the experience. The program had grown from Cody's informal speaking engagements into something much more substantial. He'd completed additional coursework in psychology and counseling techniques, earned certifications in group facilitation and crisis intervention, and worked with Dr. Chun to develop curriculum that addressed the specific needs of injured athletes. The university had provided funding for a 2-year pilot program, with the possibility of expansion if the initial results were promising. Outside the university, Cody's reputation as a speaker and advocate for injured athletes had continued to grow. He'd addressed conferences across the country, consulted with other sports medicine programs, and written articles for professional journals about the psychological aspects of sports injuries. The Western Sports Today article that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than 2 years. The speaking opportunities had also led to something unexpected, a book contract. A publisher specializing in sports narratives had approached him about writing a memoir that would explore not just his own experience, but the broader issues faced by athletes whose careers were interrupted by injury. The advance wasn't enormous, but it was enough to provide financial stability while he built his counseling practice. "I've been thinking about the book," he told Dr. Chun as they wrapped up their session debrief. "Specifically about how to structure it so that it's useful to other athletes rather than just another sports memoir. What's your current thinking? Maybe alternating chapters between my story and practical advice sections. Like, here's what happened to me, and here's what I learned that might help you if you're going through something similar." Dr. Chun nodded approvingly. That could be really valuable. There aren't many resources that combine personal narrative with practical guidance for athletic transitions. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Tommy Caldwell appeared in the doorway, his weathered face breaking into the familiar grin that had sustained Cody through some of the darkest moments of his recovery. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Tommy said, settling into the empty chair beside Cody. "Just wanted to see how the first official session went." Tommy had become an unofficial advisor to the program, attending planning meetings and providing insights from his years of experience working with injured riders. His perspective had been invaluable in helping Cody understand how to translate academic psychology concepts into language that made sense to athletes from working-class backgrounds. "It went well," Cody reported. "Better than I expected, actually. The group opened up faster than I thought they would." "That's because you're not trying to fix them," Tommy observed. You're just showing them that someone else has been where they are and found a way through. The comment touched on something that had become central to Cody's approach to counseling. Rather than positioning himself as an expert with answers, he tried to serve as a guide who'd walked a similar path and could point out landmarks and potential obstacles along the way. The distinction was subtle but important. It preserved the agency and autonomy of the athletes he worked with while providing them with hope and practical strategies for moving forward. After Tommy left, Cody drove home to the small apartment he'd rented in Boulder, close enough to the university to make his commute manageable, but far enough from his parents' ranch to maintain the independence he'd worked so hard to rebuild. The apartment was modest but comfortable, decorated with a mixture of rodeo memorabilia and books on psychology, and counseling that reflected his evolving interests and identity. That evening, he worked on the book proposal that his agent had requested, trying to articulate why his story might resonate with readers beyond the rodeo community. The challenge was striking a balance between the specificity that made the narrative authentic and the universality that would make it relevant to anyone who'd experienced significant setbacks or forced transitions. As he wrote, Cody found himself thinking about the athletes in his group and the different paths their recoveries might take. Some would probably find new competitive outlets. Maria was exploring opportunities in adaptive sports, and Jeremy was considering a transition to coaching. Others might move away from athletics entirely, using the skills and discipline they'd developed as competitors in completely different fields. The variety of possible outcomes was part of what made the work interesting and challenging. Unlike physical rehabilitation, which had relatively predictable milestones and endpoints, psychological recovery was highly individual and nonlinear. Some athletes bounced back quickly, finding new sources of meaning and purpose within months of their injuries. Others struggled for years to rebuild their sense of identity and self-worth. Cody's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Katie Morrison from Sterling High School. I'm a freshman at Colorado State now, still competing in rodeo. Saw an article about your program at CU. Would love to catch up sometime." He smiled, remembering the confident teenager who'd asked such direct questions during his first speaking engagement. Katie represented something hopeful about the next generation of athletes. Young people who understood both the rewards and risks of competitive sports and were better prepared to navigate the challenges that might arise. He texted back immediately. "Great to hear from you. Would love to catch up. How's college rodeo treating you?" Her response came quickly. "Good and hard. Different level of competition, but I'm learning a lot. The mental game is so much more important than I realized in high school." The exchange reminded Cody of one of the most satisfying aspects of his new career: the opportunity to maintain connections with young athletes and watch their development over time. It was different from the immediate gratification of competitive success, but it carried its own deep satisfaction. Over the following weeks, the athlete transition program continued to evolve and expand. Word spread through the sports medicine community about the innovative approach CU was taking to injured athlete rehabilitation, and inquiries began arriving from other universities interested in implementing similar programs. Cody found himself traveling again, but this time as a consultant helping other institutions develop their own athlete support systems. The travel was less glamorous than the rodeo circuit had been, airports and rental cars instead of truck stops and arena parking lots, but it carried a sense of purpose that felt more sustainable than his competitive career ever had. During one consulting trip to a university in Texas, he met Dr. Sarah Williams, a sports psychologist who'd been working with injured athletes for over a decade. Over coffee in the student union, she shared her perspective on why programs like Cody's were so desperately needed. "We've created this culture in sports where athletes are valued solely for their performance," she explained. "When they can't perform anymore, whether temporarily or permanently, they're discarded. But these are people with incredible discipline, work ethic, and resilience. With the right support, they can transfer those qualities to other pursuits and find success that's just as meaningful as what they achieved in sports." "What do you think is the biggest barrier to creating that support?" Cody asked. "Institutional indifference, mostly. Athletic departments and professional sports organizations invest enormous resources in developing talent, but very little in helping athletes transition out when their careers end. It's short-sighted, because former athletes could be incredible ambassadors and advocates for sports if they had positive experiences with their transitions." The conversation reinforced Cody's growing conviction that his work addressed a systemic problem rather than just individual tragedies. The sports world's approach to career-ending injuries reflected broader cultural attitudes about success, failure, and human worth that needed to be challenged and changed. 6 months after launching the program, Dr. Chun conducted a formal evaluation of its effectiveness. The results exceeded their most optimistic projections. Participants showed significant improvements in measures of depression, anxiety, and life satisfaction compared to control groups who received only traditional physical rehabilitation. More importantly, they demonstrated better long-term outcomes in terms of educational achievement, career satisfaction, and overall quality of life. "We're getting requests from the NCAA to present our findings at their annual convention," Dr. Chun told Cody during one of their regular meetings. "And there's interest from professional sports leagues about adapting the program for their retired players." The possibility of expansion was exciting, but also somewhat overwhelming. Cody had found his calling in working with injured athletes, but he wasn't sure he was ready for the kind of national platform that Dr. Chun was describing. "What would that look like practically?" he asked. "Would I need to travel constantly, or could we train other people to facilitate similar programs?" "Both, probably. You'd need to travel initially to help establish programs and train staff, but the long-term goal would be to create a model that could be replicated without requiring your direct involvement in every location." That evening, Cody called his parents to update them on the program's success and discussed the possibility of national expansion. The conversation took place in their kitchen, where so many important family discussions had occurred over the years, with the same worn wooden table and familiar view of the Colorado landscape through the window. "Sounds like you've found your calling, son," Bill West said with satisfaction. "Always knew you had more to offer the world than just riding bulls, even when you didn't know it yourself." "I'm proud of what you've built," Sarah added. "And I'm proud of how you've handled everything that's happened since the accident. You turned something terrible into something meaningful." Their support meant more to Cody than any professional recognition ever could. His parents had watched him struggle through the darkest period of his recovery without trying to push him toward premature acceptance or artificial optimism. They'd simply been present, offering stability and love while he found his own way forward. As he drove back to Boulder that night, Cody reflected on the distance he'd traveled since that awful moment in Denver when Big Gun had planted him in the arena dirt. Not just the physical distance from competitive rodeo to university counseling, but the emotional and psychological journey from despair to purpose, from feeling like his life was over to understanding that it had simply changed direction in ways he'd never anticipated. The book was nearly finished now, and his agent was optimistic about its commercial prospects. But more important than sales figures was the feedback he'd received from advance readers. Other injured athletes who said the manuscript had helped them understand their own experiences and see possibilities for their futures that they hadn't previously recognized. Tomorrow he would facilitate another group session, working with 8 more athletes who were struggling to rebuild their lives after sports. Some would recover quickly and find new directions that excited them. Others would need months or years to work through their grief and discover new sources of meaning. All of them would benefit from knowing that someone else had traveled a similar path and emerged not just intact but fulfilled. The work wasn't glamorous in the way that bull riding had been. There were no cheering crowds, no prize money, no endorsement deals. But there was something deeper and more lasting. The knowledge that his experiences, both the triumphs and the disasters, were contributing to something larger than himself. As he pulled into his apartment complex, Cody's phone buzzed with a message from Maria Santos, the gymnast from his first group session. "Started my master's program in sports psychology today. Thank you for showing me that there are different ways to stay connected to athletics. I want to do what you do." He smiled as he read the message, understanding that this was what success looked like in his new arena. Not 8 seconds of perfection followed by applause, but the slow, steady work of helping people discover that their stories didn't end when their original dreams were derailed. They simply began new chapters that might be even more meaningful than the ones they'd planned. In the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by the books and papers that represented his evolving career, Cody West finally felt at peace with the path his life had taken. The boy who'd left his family's ranch to chase bull riding glory had returned as a man who understood that true success wasn't measured in seconds or scores, but in the positive impact you could have on other people's lives. Big Gun might have won their 8-second battle in Denver, but Cody had won something more important. the opportunity to transform his pain into purpose, his setback into service, and his broken dreams into a foundation for helping others rebuild their own lives. In the new arena he'd chosen, there were no time limits, no judges, and no final scores. There was only the ongoing work of human connection and the deep satisfaction that came from using his story to help others write better endings to their own. If that story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories.